Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us in today's webinar, Successful Leadership During COVID-19, Supporting Remote Teams. My name is Yusra Benjeloun, Administrative Coordinator and Project Manager with the Work Wellness Institute, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. We would like to thank our academic team and our 9 founding partner organizations in the Harnessing Talent project. Harnessing Talent, Alliance for Recruiting and Retaining Canadians with Disabilities and Mental Health Challenges, is a 3-year project funded by Employment and Social Development Canada. This webinar is made possible through the support of ESDC, as well as donations and memberships to WWI. We thank our advisory committee and speakers who contribute to this webinar series. While we're waiting for others to join us, I'll go over a few technical points for the webinar. You should be able to hear the presentation through your computer speakers or through the conference call line if you dialed in. Please use the question box to submit any issues you may be experiencing, any comments you may have, and any questions related to the webinar. We will collect questions submitted throughout the webinar and follow it with a Q&A based on the questions submitted. A reminder to members, if you are a WWI or VRA Canada member, you receive free certificates of attendance. Following the webinar, any questions not answered in the allotted time will be answered and distributed after the event. The presentation will be recorded and posted for free on our website along with the slides. You will be emailed the direct links for all of these items when they're available. We're very excited to welcome Dr. Laura Hambley and April Dyrda. Dr. Laura is an industrial organizational psychologist based in Calgary, Alberta. She's co-founder and president of Work Evolution, which creates innovative assessment and training for mobile remote employees, leaders, and teams. Since 2004, Dr. Laura has published extensive research on the critical success factors for effectively leading distributed teams and is considered a global thought leader on this topic. Dr. Laura also co-founded Canada Career Counseling and the Leadership Success Group. April is a registered provisional psychologist and workplace psychology consultant with nearly a decade of experience supporting leaders and teams with career transition and change. Involved with Work Evolution since its inception in 2014, April brings a specialized research and counseling background to her work through years of experience providing individual therapy at Synthesis Psychology and career development support with Calgary Career Counseling. Dr. Laura and Ms. April, we are so happy to have you back online with us today. Thank you so much for accepting to speak to us about how to be a successful leader to a remote team in the context of a pandemic. I will let you take over.
Thank you so much for having us again, and this topic is definitely near and dear to us. We've been having a lot of these conversations since COVID hit, and definitely for the 6 years before that, where we were really specialized in remote leadership and teamwork, and now we have the opportunity to bring what we know to a broader platform. So I want to say that I know it's been a really difficult period of time for many people. We're going into the holiday season, which brings about more challenges, especially with restrictions in certain locations. And I hope that what April and I have to share will bring you some useful information to apply not only to your organizations, but your own lives. So we're going to go on to the next slide here, April. April is yes, thank you so much. Yeah, so we bring our 17 years of research experience. Whatever we talk about is based in evidence and the field of industrial and organizational psychology, which is a fancy way of saying workplace psychology. And we're really committed to supporting the human elements of distributed work success, whether that's leaders, teams, individual contributors, and cultures. So the next slide talks about how we've been speaking a lot over the years in the media on this topic. When there was the whole talk about returning to the office, we were talking to the media a lot about how what we think is the ideal is a hybrid solution, a mix of being able to work remotely and working from the office depending on your role, your home office situation, and your work style. So that's something we've been talking about a lot. And this article from Scientific American magazine is in 2016 when we published the first personality profile of a remote worker. So what makes someone able to work remotely and thrive in this setting? And then other people challenged with that. Well, there's definitely personality at play. And at the moment, I'm at my home office. April's at our office in downtown Calgary in Kensington. But we switch back and forth. We work when and where we're most effective. And with the shutdowns here in Alberta, we're doing very little time in the office, other than some counseling when people need to be in person. And you see the screen behind April is a plastic barrier allowing for counseling to continue for people that don't have the privacy in their home settings. So what's interesting to think about is the fact that people need support, and there's different ways that we can do it. So this next slide here is about what we do in terms of leaders, teams, individual contributors. We do all kinds of assessments to really get at what are the strengths, what are the gaps when it comes to remote work success. And then we do a whole bunch of training and coaching around this topic. So the next slide is about this session in terms of ground rules and housekeeping. Just we ask that be here now, maintain confidentiality if certain questions are asked and shared, and then make use of the interactive features. And we have 4 polling questions, so we're excited about that and excited to get some Q&A going as well. So we're going to talk about challenges and opportunities of distributed or remote leadership. We're going to dive into work-life wellness, trust, and communication, which are 3 topics that are so important that we do half-day, 2-hour trainings, etc. on each of these topics alone, let alone all crammed into one. So we're giving you high level, but we're also giving you some tangible takeaways, of course. So the next slide is about how the data are in when it comes to the impacts of COVID-19 on distributed workplaces. The data are in that the majority of people want flexibility. They want at least some of the time to be able to work remotely. They're finding that there's a really good balance to be had. That's not everybody, but we're finding that, you know, a fair number of people are asking for this to continue. Less so for organizations. We're finding that, you know, about half of organizations are saying this is going to be a strategic opportunity to change the way we work, to change the way we support our people. There'll be real estate savings involved, etc. But we got to do it right. We got to have a strategy around it. And then about half are saying, you know, we just want everyone back to the office. This has been really brutal, and we just need everyone back because then we'll know they're working and we'll be able to see them. And part of our culture is being together, and we miss the people. And I think that an all or nothing mindset like that is actually not the way to go. I think it's having a hybrid solution. Again, but it depends, of course, on a lot of different factors. So going forward, given the fact that remote work is here to stay in certain shapes and forms, what are the opportunities of remote work? Well, satisfaction and engagement of your people, definitely. Maintaining energy, enthusiasm, happiness, engagement, if you do it right, if you manage this right, if you have the culture that supports this. Balance, we call it work-life wellness, but the idea of health and wellness and balance and mental wellness, I mean, it's all very, very important, and it is an opportunity of remote work. And then focus and performance. So we find that on the next slide here, that there's a productivity gain from remote work. If you do it well, you can be 10 to 30% more productive, and that's across research. However, the image here of someone doing childcare and trying to navigate work, that was a lot of our situation if we had kids back in March, April, May, June, that it was a really tough balance for working parents to do this. And this is not the ideal scenario. So the ideal scenario for a home office worker is to have a private space without interruptions, where they can have boundaries between the work and the rest of their lives, etc. And not all of us have that, so it really depends on our context whether working remotely is an ideal situation. So let's go to the next slide here. And the challenges, I mean, without a doubt, there are challenges, and we are talking about these a lot. There's no water cooler. It makes it more difficult to have impromptu conversations. We lack the nonverbal and we have the technology challenges. Building trust is harder and easier to damage, as we'll talk about later in this session. We can't lead on the fly by walking around the hall and running into people and seeing that they're struggling. We have more challenges building relationships, and there's spillover and crossover effects between our work lives and our home lives when they're all in one place, right? So we have boundary issues. So we talk about blurred boundaries quite a bit. And then building cohesive teams and feeling part of a team, that takes more effort when you're remote. And there's a competition for our energy between the different spheres of our lives, especially in the midst of a pandemic. So we have, our energy is not infinite, it's finite, and we need to determine where and how to direct our energy. So those are some of the challenges. And I'm going to ask you, given these challenges, what do you struggle most with when working remotely? So we're going to launch the poll. Thanks, Yusra. We're going to ask you, is it establishing clear boundaries between work and life? Is it maintaining communication with your team? Is it productivity and making sure it's staying strong? Is it setting your own structure and organizing your team? Or is it other? And if it's other, please feel free to use the chat to list another struggle that might beat all of these struggles. So let's see what's coming in here. Okay, so we see the highest percent of you, and thank you for answering this, is that maintaining communication is the biggest challenge. So we'll definitely give you some strategies around that. And then we have two tied at 21%, the boundaries between work and life and ensuring productivity is strong. So I always say that wellness and productivity need to be equal focuses in organizations. If one is suffering, the other will. So thank you for this. And we'll move on to the next slide, which is leading remotely. Okay, so leading remotely compared to face-to-face leadership. Okay, so leadership in an office setting where we're together every day. You need all the skills and traits to be a good face-to-face leader, plus you need additional skills and traits. So basically there's more to be done to be an effective remote leader. There's more that you need. It takes more work and it takes greater intentionality. So on the next slide here, we're just going to show you our model that we created over the last 6 years about, well, what are the skills and what are the traits of a leader and what are the capabilities that they need to do remote leadership well. And I must say that remote leadership has a way of unveiling leadership challenges. So if you have a leader, for example, who's maybe a micromanager at the office, or they're moody and volatile, or whatever it is, you take them into a remote setting and it's only going to get worse. Okay, the impacts that they have are only going to get worse because it unveils some of these problems. Another good example is if a leader is not natural at performance, motivating people to perform and managing performance and giving constructive feedback, it's not going to get any better remotely. In fact, it's going to unveil the problem. So this next slide talks about how there's a model that we've created where skills, so we have 6 areas of skills and 12 areas of traits that we assess leaders on in the psychometric assessment to really get that bottom of their strengths and gaps. And it's a beautiful tool that we've had the fortune of having a lot of leaders go through it this year and in past years, but especially this year. And we look at where is that leader on relationships, flexibility, productivity, and culture. And there's these 13 different elements underneath which we call capabilities. So how accessible and supportive is the leader? Are they good at fostering collaboration? Are they good at achieving their own work-life balance and promoting it in their team? You can be good at it yourself and not so good at promoting it, for example, which we say is a bit hypocritical, but it does happen. So again, this is a model that we use, and in today's session, we're really going to look at building trust, and we're going to look at communication and a little bit on balance or wellness. So the next slide here is from our profiler. So we call it our distributed leader profiler. You'll see this leader here has different levels of these capabilities, and able to have an open, honest conversation and a coaching conversation about where are your strengths and where might you want to make adjustments so you can become the best remote leader you can possibly be. So it's all about developing. This is a new area for a lot of leaders, and the ones that I really hear resisting it are the ones that say, I need to be together with my people. I miss being able to manage by presenteeism. They don't use the word presenteeism, but we do. But it's the idea of bums in seats. If I see the bum in the seat, I know that they're productive, and I call BS on that because a bum in a seat does not mean productivity. What means productivity is, are you achieving your actions, your outputs, your deliverables, your KSAs, whatever, or sorry, KPIs, your KPIs, whatever it is that you're measured on, are you achieving those outcomes? That is performance. So the next slide here is, so this leader in particular, based on the gaps that might come out, we're able to say, okay, there's a caution area here, there's a challenge, and what do you do about it? And we give lots of advice on this form. So the next slide here is the idea that I just want to sum up my section of this presentation. Leading in a distributed world is harder. And this is from a leading researcher who used to be at Harvard, and he dedicated his career to studying high-performing teams. And what he always said was that the structural conditions that face-to-face teams have are really just as critical for virtual teams, with one caveat: it's harder to create the conditions of success when you're virtual or at a distance. And that's what I'm saying. It unveils challenges, it causes more challenges, but I'll tell you, I'm still a huge fan of remote work and the hybrid model. It's not a one-size-fits-all. That's what you have to remember, but I think it has a lot of benefits to human beings. And I think it's the 50% of organizations that maintain some of that after COVID that are the places people will want to work. So with that, I'm going to pass the baton to April.
All right. Thank you, Laura. I think it's clear, based on the case Laura just made, that this isn't really easy to do. Certainly the skills that leaders require to be effective in their team leadership and themselves are certainly additional to what would be required of you in the office. So hopefully what we can do in the next 20 minutes here is help you with identifying some habits to support success for yourself and for your teams when working remotely. And the first area that we're going to touch on today is going to be the work-life wellness and mental health piece. Now, we had already said that we spend full days, sometimes half days, talking about these topics, and we're just going to scratch the surface in the time we have together. But hopefully give you something that's actionable, something that you can take away and apply in your own day-to-day. A big part about what contributes to our wellness in work and in life is our ability to maintain and communicate our boundaries so that these domains don't spill over or cross over into each other. This is really especially important when we're working from home, as many of us are, when the separation between work and life is already a little bit blurred. So something I'm going to be talking about a lot in this section is the idea of communicating your boundaries. The first thing I'd like to do, though, is point out the fact that this arrangement is not ideal for most people. So what we know from our research over the past 17 years or so is that it's actually only a small percentage of people who really strive in these conditions, who can work from home all of the time and feel just as productive and engaged and effective as when in the office. Now, what we do know is the majority of people fit into that mid zone of the bell curve. So wanting to work remotely just some of the time, so on average 2 or 3 days per week. Now, we actually have an assessment called the Distributed Work Profiler that we can use to predict where people will fall on this bell curve based on their preferences. And it's a really great asset to be able to know how people work best so that we're able to support them in that capacity. Now, given the reality of our situation currently and knowing that everyone has to work remotely for the most part, our job then as leaders becomes being able to adapt habits to support success as best we can when under these conditions, which is what we're going to get into now a little bit. So I want to start this section with a quick polling question, and Yusra, you might have to let me know what the responses are because I noticed I wasn't actually able to see them on my screen. But hopefully that's easy enough to do. I did just mention it's not ideal for a lot of people to work from home all of the time, and my guess is you've personally encountered some struggles with this. So we're going to launch our second polling question now, for you just to get a sense of what you struggle with most when it comes to remote work-life wellness. So is it that you forget to take breaks? Is it perhaps that you are not taking time to get up and move around and stretch or go outside? Are you working too long? Are you working into the evenings or on the weekends? Or are you actually finding that things are better than ever for you?
So I can read the answers for you, April. So 0% of our audience forgets to take breaks, but the majority, so 64%, does not take time to move, stretch, or get fresh air. 21% works long hours, evenings and weekends, and then 14% do not have a struggle and they feel better than ever.
All right. Well, that's kind of good to hear. Good for you all for not forgetting to take breaks. That's awesome. It is often the case, actually, that we see people struggling with that second option the most, not getting up and moving around and stretching and things like that in your day. The reality is that our work is very stationary now. We're all probably sitting at our desk or at our kitchen table or laying in bed working. So we don't have the option as much now to go walk to someone's office or go use a boardroom to take a meeting or, you know, grab a coffee with someone from work. So the opportunity for that isn't there anymore, and we do have to be quite intentional about creating that space. So you're part of a large majority, certainly.
And I would say we've been really encouraging getting fresh air, even if it's chilly out, like in our neck of the woods here in Calgary. There can be some really chilly days, but that fresh air is critical. And if it's nice enough weather, put in earbuds and do a walking meeting. So have one of your meetings walking. I encourage you to try it. It's hugely beneficial. The brain works better, the ideas flow, and it gets steps in and fresh air. It's a beautiful concept.
Yeah, there's research that shows that changing your setting lights up areas of the brain connected to creativity and innovation. So if you're in a brainstorming meeting especially, that might be something you want to think about doing. All right, so I've mentioned boundaries a couple of times already, and really one of the most helpful things we can do for ourselves when we're struggling with work-life wellness is to put boundaries into place, but also to communicate those boundaries with other people, and this is often a missing step. So some really simple ways to do this include setting boundaries and commuting your working hours. So especially if those are irregular, which I think a lot of people are working irregular hours right now. A large percentage of you said you do work in the evenings and on the weekends. And personally, I often work best in the early evening. And so I'm not always available first thing in the morning when everyone else is starting their day and getting on email. So if people know when you're working, they're also going to know when they can expect to hear from you. And you can also clarify how people can get a hold of you when you're not working. So when there's a case of urgency. Yesterday is a really good example for Laura and I. She texted me in the morning to see when I would be online because there was an urgent email in my inbox. So even though it wasn't during my regular work hours, I still welcomed that message because it signaled me to attend to something urgent. And this is really important to do because being able to define your preferences regarding work hours and response times, that's naturally going to give other people permission to do the same. And it also gives them the ability to reach you as quickly as possible. And that's really difficult to do when we communicate asynchronously, given that we're not often face-to-face right now. So that improved efficiency that we can get out of that extra layer of communication can be quite valuable. And this brings me to my next point, which is to create space in your day. When we work remotely, we and our employees can feel pressure to work continuously. Most of you felt that, right? I can tell by you not getting up and taking time to stretch. That's probably the case. So some really simple tips to avoid this include not scheduling meetings over lunch or at the end of your workday, limiting your own email responding to certain times of the day. We actually recommend 2 sessions per day for email, and making use of a delayed send feature. So if you're emailing outside of work hours, making sure that that's not going out until the next business day. And this makes it so people feel like they don't have to constantly be on when they work remotely. And I've mentioned emails in this slide a couple of times because the reality is that responding to emails is actually not as productive as we think. And most of the time it's actually a distraction or interruption to the regular flow of our work. So I would challenge all of you to be very conscious of how much time you're spending on email and to create and carve out periods of time in your day when you're on email and then when you're not checking email. Okay. And these are just a couple of quick ideas about how to promote your wellness through better boundaries. If you're curious at all about your own work-life wellness, we've actually created a scale to measure this for you. And the link is included on the slide if you'd like to access it there. It's free to you and gets you to reflect on how your work interacts with your life. And the survey itself is actually quite short. It should only take a few minutes to complete, and the results are instantly available to you, which is also kind of a bonus. One thing I like to note about this scale is it does capture a moment in time. So the idea is that your score is likely to change depending on how well you are. And so I usually take the survey myself about once a month as a way to check in and see how I'm doing. And I'd encourage you to do the same as well. All right, so the next section we're going to dig into a little bit here is how to improve trust when working remotely, which really is the foundation of team success, as I'll explain here shortly for you. And the reason the topic of trust comes up so much is because having employees work away from the office is in fact an act of trust in itself, right? We can't see that individual. It's more difficult to assess things like effectiveness and productivity. So any metric of success then all require trust. And it's part of why we put it at the foundation of success in the remote work context. So knowing that trust is so foundational, it's also important to know how to build it. And I want to pose a question to the group now to see what you think is the most important aspect of building trust when working remotely. So I'm going to have Yusra launch a polling question to collect your answers on this. And yes, arguably they're all correct in some way, but curious to know what you would say is the most critical and important aspect to building trust when you work apart. We'll leave a couple minutes for that now.
So nobody thinks one of the most important aspects of building trust is getting to know your colleagues on a personal level. The majority thinks that keeping and delivering on your promises is the most important aspect. Next is 33% for E, transparent communication, 20% for D, taking time to acknowledge everyone's contribution, and finally B, 7%, keeping others informed of your progress.
Great. Okay, thank you, Yusra. Now, none of you are wrong, but the majority who selected C is actually correct. You're all a very sharp group this afternoon. So it is, of course, a tough question. As I said, each of these are important aspects to building trust, of course. But the reason why C is the right answer, or the most right answer, is because it is absolutely foundational to keep and deliver on your promises and deliverables. The reason is because without that, there is nothing for trust to be built on. So in other words, consistency here is really, really key. Researchers have shown that we have a tendency to integrate information about people's behavior into whether we see them as trustworthy or not. And in particular, we as human beings pay specific attention to ability and integrity. We see those as being really key predictors of trust. And doing what you say you're going to do is a way to demonstrate integrity and ability. So it gives people something to trust in. And that's why we see it as playing such a fundamental role here. So if we want to be the types of leaders who keep and deliver on our promises, what does it actually look like? Well, one thing we know is that trustworthy leaders are fantastic at practicing inclusivity and transparency. And oftentimes when this isn't happening, it's because of a well-intentioned mistake. While we might be tempted, for example, to exclude people from conversations in an effort not to flood their inbox, the reality is if you're giving mixed messages or saying different things to different people, that's when the potential to damage trust begins. So the good news is there's a lot of great tools out now that exist to help with the sharing of information, to help with inboxes not being overcrowded. So Teams is a good example, Slack channels. Our organization has moved almost entirely to not using email for internal purposes, which seemed impossible at first, but has actually worked fantastically to help us stay on top of things. The second piece is that we should never assume that someone has received something and understood it as we've intended. So you really do need to take that extra step, especially when we're limited to virtual communication. We naturally do this already in person, so it doesn't have to be as intentional. When we explain something to someone, we'll usually follow it up with a question like, does that make sense? Do you have any questions about that? But we don't always take that step in virtual communication. So really be active and proactive about, first of all, ensuring your message has been received when you're sending it, but also providing feedback yourself when you're receiving that communication. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about here in regards to trust, and it's probably the overarching aspect of creating a culture of trust, is knowing that it's actually not productive to make people earn it. Instead, what we say is to give people trust. It's much more empowering when it's in the hands of the people you're working with to continue to maintain and further build trust instead of feeling like they have to prove themselves. And this also means that others expect the same in return, and brings me back to that point of transparency. Always keep your promises and deliverables, of course, as best as you can, but when that's not possible, communicate delays, talk about changes that happen, explain difficulties you're running into. Teams that operate with a high level of trust also tend to operate much more efficiently. And that's in large part because they're transparent about what's going well, but also what's not going well. All right, and then the third and final section that we're going to talk about today is improving communication. This is easily the most commonly cited struggle from people who work apart from their teams, especially when they're doing it for the first time. And I know a lot of you had mentioned communication as well as being something you'd like to develop a bit more. So hopefully what we present here will be helpful to you. The first thing that I want to mention in this section is that any and all of your communications should be versatile. In the most basic sense, this means not over-relying on any one communication method, and if we're being honest with ourselves, it's usually email. This really quickly becomes a dumping ground for absolutely anything and everything, and it's typically ineffective at achieving most things. So instead, there's two things that are worth considering before sending out any type of communication. First is the appropriate medium for the task. So what communication method would best match the message I'm delivering? And then the appropriate medium for the person based on their individual preferences. Laura knows I am not one to pick up my phone if it rings, so she will always text me first because that's how I am most accessible. So make sure that you clarify and tailor the amount and type of communication to the individual needs of those you're working with, knowing that one size really doesn't fit all when it comes to those preferences. And the simplest way to do this, of course, is to explicitly ask people how they prefer to communicate. For instance, would they like to be contacted through email, text message, phone, Skype, instant message, and go into more depth. What do they prefer for particular kinds of tasks, for certain times of day, for varying levels of importance, and then clarify these boundaries with each other so that you're comfortable reaching out when you need to, and therefore maximizing the efficiency of your communication. And then one of the most used strategies that we speak about in these sessions is this slide here, the regular check-in. And it's so critical when we work apart because the informal communications and conversations, the water cooler or hallway talks, are things that people notice missing almost immediately when they are no longer in the office. And the reality is if we're not intentional about creating space for these conversations when we work remotely, it's not going to happen. And there's a huge cost to losing that face time. So we recommend two strategies to reestablish that. One is the virtual coffee, which is all about relationship building. So this would involve taking 20 minutes to get on a Zoom call or any other video conferencing platform with a team member of yours and just chat. This works to really facilitate better awareness. It creates a touch point and therefore an opportunity for regular support and guidance so that things aren't being pushed off or delayed to the next project meeting or team meeting or whatever it might be. And then the next are team huddles or drive-bys. These look a little bit different, but they serve as a really good way to be accessible to immediately address any priorities or concerns that the team has. So these are usually quite brief, 15-minute conversations with a larger group, and can be especially important in the early phases of a project during high-intensity periods. I know at the start of COVID, our administrative team met every single morning for 15 minutes and then every single Monday for 15 minutes. And it really just helped for the smooth operation of the business. A lot of people are spending a lot of time in meetings during COVID, and I say, you know, it shouldn't be longer than about 15, 20 minutes if you can keep it that way, if it's just for the point of checking in. Both of these, of course, work wonders to improve support, but also levels of trust. It enhances communication, it builds information sharing, and it honestly just heightens engagement and commitment to the task at hand. So invite that from your team, and they're ultimately going to feel more comfortable reaching out for support when needed as a result. Now, the reason we push for these check-ins so much, and I realize I tried to hammer that point home quite a bit there, but they are a form of active support. And this is really actually necessary in the virtual workspace. A lot of times when we're working in the office, we can easily slip into this passive support role, and it actually is sufficient. It works okay. The open door policy is a really good example of that. The reality is that this type of support is typically reactive. So leaders will say things like, I'm always available if you need me, or reach out anytime and I'm happy to connect. And that's great, but what it does is it puts the onus of responsibility on the employee to connect with you when something is needed. And people aren't always going to be inclined to take that first step, especially during times of uncertainty, like what we're seeing right now. So active leaders, on the other hand, much more typically take a proactive approach to the support they provide. So they don't wait until something has gone wrong to engage their staff, but rather they take the time to conduct those regular check-ins. They schedule that face time with their people. And when this is happening regularly, it also means that follow-up is happening regularly. And as a result, responsibility for when support is provided is shared more between the employee and the leader. So I'd encourage you all to think about where you might fall on this spectrum from passive to active support and what you can be doing to more closely bring yourself to that place on the active side of things. Great. I'm going to hand things back to Laura now, and she'll wrap up the presentation for us.
So we have a polling question. Given what April just shared about communication, which area could you most improve with? Scheduling more regular huddles or drive-bys, relying less on email as a form of communication, running more efficient virtual meetings, or better utilizing team software to chat and keep in touch, such as Slack or MS Teams. So let's launch this, Yusra, and see what people have to say. All right, oh, okay, there we go. Excellent, thank you guys. So 38%, so the majority of you, the highest percent said relying less on email. Yeah, we're still an email-based work society, but I have a feeling that we're going to see that diminishing over time because email has been suffocating and it's been really impacting people's productivity. So like April alluded to, the more you can get some of the conversations onto MS Teams chats or onto Slack or other platforms, the fewer emails will be required, and email will start to be no longer an immediate habit for every communication. It'll become a decision point of which communication medium is best for my purpose. So I really encourage that. The next percent is 31%, running more efficient virtual meetings. And that is absolutely the case. And what I've been hearing is that people are zoomed out. So they are in meeting after meeting, and the meetings are usually booked as an hour, because in our Outlook calendars, for example, the default is by the hour or by the 30-minute segment. So what happens is we get hour-long blocks booked one after the other without any bio breaks, without any stretch breaks. I mean, no wonder you guys aren't stretching and getting out for fresh air, because you don't even have 10 minutes to work because you're on to your next Zoom meeting or whatever platform you're using. So we've been working with organizations on setting up very firm, very clear meeting policies. And if you can have some policies in place, like certain times of the day or certain days of the week where meetings can't occur, where there's focus time on your team. If you can have 50-minute maximum instead of 1-hour meetings, you allow the 10 minutes to transition between meetings and actually take care of your health and actually take time to breathe and transition. So once you can set up clear policies on fewer meetings and more efficient meetings, and you can open up more white space, it helps productivity, it helps wellness, and it helps a whole lot of other things. So I want you to keep that in mind. Are you doing the right number of meetings? Are the right people in those meetings, or are you over meeting? And then the third place here is 25% said more regular huddles and drive-bys. Absolutely, and I think during the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of us were pretty good at this. It was just a reaction. Okay, we need to keep in touch. We need to huddle because our whole organization or our business is impacted by this. But I encourage you to have these huddles regularly and just say, how are you doing? Is there anything I can do to support you? And this goes an incredibly long way to staying on top of any issues, challenges, and showing your people that you genuinely care. Which we need more than ever with the echo pandemic, and the echo pandemic is a mental health pandemic. So we need to stay a step ahead of this more than ever, especially during the holidays. And January is going to be a tough month for people too. So that's that. And the next slide, April, is the distributed team effectiveness. So if you work as part of a team, so whether you have a team of direct reports, whether you have a project team you lead, a department that you lead, whatever it is, you probably have some form of team that you are a part of. And when you're looking at your distributed or remote team, I want you to think of this. I want you to think that leadership is the glue that holds it together. And being a strong leader, an engaged leader, and a caring leader are all very, very important in remote work. But also important is how well the team's communicating, coordinating, and collaborating. So we like to assess teams on their health. So if you think of a team just like a human being, the team can be healthy or unhealthy or somewhere in between. Most teams are somewhere in between. So if you can just go back one, April, the team climate that we like to look at is how trusting is the team? How committed are they? Accountable, results driven, and strategic. So we're able to assess a remote team and really get at some of the pain points. And usually there's a lot of strengths and there's a lot of challenges, and we try to figure out with the team, how can we help you become a better team? How can you help yourself become a better team. And we often will encourage a remote team charter. So given that we're working remotely, what are the expectations around communication, collaboration, conflict, meetings, etc.? So the meeting rules that I talked about could go into the charter document. So moving on to the next slide is the diagnostic that I mentioned. So it's about strengths and immediate actions. So that's something that we definitely would recommend. And then the next slide is what we do is we take the average rating. So rather than knowing what each person on the team said, we aggregate, and then we can see, okay, this team has an overall climate score of 3.76. So you think of a team climate, it's almost like an engagement score for an organization, but it's what's that team's climate. And then we're able to look at, is trust falling below a 4? Okay, what's going on there? Let's talk openly about that, etc. This team's actually doing pretty good, but when we start seeing teams going below 3s and into 2s, then we know we have some alarm bells ringing that we need to address. So that's teams. And then the final slide here is for our Q&A period. So we've allowed 15 minutes. We've covered a lot of territory, but we're happy to go into a little more depth on any of these topics or on specific scenarios you're dealing with and you would like some input on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Laura and Ms. Dyrda, for this timely and compelling webinar. Onto the Q&A session. To our attendees, if you have any questions, please input them in the question box. And our first question is, when we say flexibility, we often think about hours of work, but are there other aspects of flexibility that need to be considered?
I can maybe speak to this a little bit, Laura, and then pass it off to you. The one thing I think about in terms of flexibility that comes immediately to mind is in terms of evaluation. So a lot of organizations are shifting how they evaluate performance among staff members, particularly those who they're not working face-to-face with anymore. So as Laura mentioned, we don't have the bums in seats. People assume it's more difficult to measure productivity, although that's not necessarily the case. But we see flexibility movement from measuring based on input to now measuring based on output more commonly. So that's something that's changing a little bit too now in terms of how we work, and particularly flexibility in performance evaluation.
That's a good point, and I wonder if this question too is getting at, so flexibility in hours, so in when you start your day, when you finish your day, right? So that is one type of flexibility. So if I'm more of a morning person and I want to start my day at 6 a.m. and maybe finish my day at 2:30 p.m. or something, that's one type of flexibility. But I think the bigger and equally important flexibility is where we work. And I think this whole movement to forced remote work to optional remote work, where we talk about giving people the option to work when and where they're most effective. So the where would be, if I'm effective working 2 days from home, 3 days from the office. That's what I usually do, by the way, and I've been doing for about 15 years now. It's a great balance for me. That's flexibility, and I wouldn't work for an employer that wouldn't give me that type of flexibility, because I know on my home office days I'm super focused, I get a lot done. When I go into the office, I can collaborate with my team and have those meetings where we want to discuss things together. But so that's another term of flexibility. And another idea of flexibility is giving people, permission to deal with life's curveballs and still get their work done. So if that means doing something with my kids during the day because I have to do some homeschooling, that I have the flexibility to make up that time in an evening, right? So that's again time-based. So time and location are the two keys, I would say. So hopefully that answered your question.
Those are great points. Thank you so much, Dr. Laura and Ms. April. And our next question is, you mentioned that the majority of workers or employees prefer a mix of remote work and on-site work. Any ideas why and how can the balance be beneficial?
Any ideas why? Well, I think that the why is that I think people like having a mix of focus time and collaborative time, and people like a change of scenery. People, I mean, we're creatures. I mean, some of us are creatures of habit, but I mean, a lot of human beings like appreciate the idea of, you know, having different settings around them and not being in the same setting all of the time. And I think that distributed or flexible work allows you to have the best of both worlds. And that's why the 2-3 day split seems to be the best for the most people when we assess them on their work style and their personality and stuff. But just because my personality says a 2 to 3 day split is good for me, I may have like 4 kids running around at home and no private office because each of the offices is a kid's bedroom. And I've worked with VPs like that. They're working remotely and they're in the master ensuite because that's the only place that they can set up a quiet office. So I guess what I want to say is that there has to be the right workspace, and that if people can have the right workspace at home and the right workspace at an office, and they can have the best of both worlds, being to collaborate in the office, that seems to be the best. But again, it really depends on the job at hand and the other factors around the locations and the tasks they do and the team they work with, etc. You want to add to that, April?
Yeah, so what's the follow-up question to that, Yusra?
So it was, how can this balance be beneficial, and the why?
Yeah, and we do typically see productivity increase quite substantially, as Laura had mentioned. So there's of course a business case for it too. The office, if we're being honest, is not actually the best place to do all work for most people. And so in terms of an organizational perspective, the productivity, the output is much higher, we see. And of course for the individual too, in terms of their own understanding of fit, it makes a huge difference. The third most frequently cited part of people's work that they would look for in a job is the ability to have a flexible work environment. And that comes third to financial stability and the ability to help others. So it's really a huge piece of value add from an employee perspective.
Thank you so much. That makes a lot of sense. Our next question is about trust. So what are the signs that employers should pay attention to and that indicate that the trust between them and their employee is broken?
Laura, do you want to start, or would you like me to take this on?
Why don't you start? I have ideas percolating, but I want to hear what you have to say first.
Sure. So, I mean, there's really a lot of ways to damage trust, and there's a lot of ways that that's noticed in people. Typically, the most evident one is that communication will decrease quite a bit, and often because the ways we damage trust are through miscommunication. So sending mixed messages, being inconsistent, forgetting to acknowledge a person's contributions, taking credit for someone else's work, those sorts of things. So oftentimes you'll see information sharing go down quite substantially, would be the first thing we see. That's my most immediate thought. I don't know if you have anything else to add there, Laura.
Yeah, so it's when there's trust damage, what you see in the employee, like April said, less communication, maybe more behaviors that are trying to cover themselves or like prove themselves, right? Feeling that they have to report every single thing they're working on when it might be overkill. But more often than not, we see signs of distrust coming from the leader to the people, and the sign that we see is micromanagement for sure is a big sign. So trying to control, trying to micromanage. There's a difference between checking in and checking up on. Checking up on is, I don't really trust you, April, I'm going to check up that you're actually working on this, versus checking in is, April, how's it going? Is there anything I can do to support you? So yeah, we see that checking up and micromanaging, and usually the people will react in one of two ways. They'll distance and they'll try to, you know, they'll become very quiet or passive, or they'll become very much trying to control what they can and trying to manage by, you know, oversharing or, So it's behaviors that are inefficient, right? So if you see a change in behavior, if someone is doing something that's almost like a make work project to prove themselves or something, that it could be due to some mistrust there.
Thank you so much. And what in that case, what can an employer do to rebuild it?
Oh, checking in, not checking up, having huddles, having clear goals and metrics. I mean, people like knowing what's expected of them, and they like appreciation, right? And feedback if it's delivered right. So if you can give people feedback, praise, appreciation, constructive feedback done in a helpful way, you are going to be doing your job as a strong leader. And that's what people crave, and I think is missing in some cases, and it can really be demotivating for people. Do you have anything to add to that, April?
Yeah, I mean, one thing to think about too is to be very clear with your intentions. So oftentimes when there's a breach in trust, there's an understanding that your intentions are not positive. And so typically we make our intentions clear, or sorry, the impacts of our intentions clear, but we don't make the intention itself clear. So being very deliberately communicative in that way and transparent with people about the reason behind why you're doing something will prevent them from jumping to what might likely be a negative conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. And then working remotely, we are very, very dependent to online technology and communication tools. So in the case where team members are experiencing technical problems at home and find it challenging to do their job, what can employers do to accommodate, and what do you know what are their duties actually to accommodate and make help or support their employees?
Yeah, so it's tricky. So I call it tech savvy, right? So as a leader, there's some leaders that say, I'm just not good at technology. It's not my thing, right? And I always say, well, in this day and age, and with our now reliance on technology more than ever, you need to learn the basic bells and whistles. You need to go online and take tutorials. You need to just educate yourself enough so that you know some of the main, functionalities and the main troubleshooting, right? So that you can help guide. You don't have to become the local IT expert, but you need to be able to guide yourself to understand the technology, and you need to be able to support your people, but also having strong tech support available and training and giving your people permission to take an hour-long training on how to use Teams or Zoom, or 2 hours of training, or whatever it is, and giving them encouragement and permission to do the training, because quite often what I'm seeing is people are just thrown on these platforms and they do not understand the basics, like the etiquette. Like, people will come on to meetings like this, right, and their head is cut off and and it's, okay, first things first, lighting, second things, acoustic, third things, centered on your screen, shoulders up, right? So there's all these rules of the etiquette, and then there's the rules of, like, what do you do if the technology goes down? Well, you have a plan B. What's the plan B? Everyone needs to know what the plan B is, okay? So if this all of a sudden crashes, we'll see you in a few minutes on the other platform, or we'll see you on the conference line. But too often we don't have plan Bs, and we don't know the basic bells and whistles, and it's all trial and error, and it's such an efficiency suck, because the first 5 minutes of every meeting are just getting everyone on, and it shouldn't be that difficult. It's taking a lot of our valuable time. Would you agree, April?
Yeah, I think that's perfect.
Yeah, that's an excellent answer. Thank you so much, Dr. Laura. And I think we can wrap the webinar here. And so thank you so much, Dr. Laura and Ms. April, for updating us on the challenges and opportunities presented by remote work during the COVID-19 crisis, and also for describing key recommendations and strategies to maintain trust, communication, and wellness when leading from a distance. So immediately following the webinar, our audience will be directed to the evaluation survey. We greatly appreciate your input on our webinars as well as suggestions for future topic areas. Our next webinar is a panel webinar on continuing to work from home amidst COVID-19. It will be held on Thursday, January 14 at 11 a.m. Pacific time, 2 p.m. Eastern time. The webinar will be presented by Dr. Arla Day, Dr. Kevin Kellaway from the Samari University, and Manu Nelutla from ActSafe Association. All of our webinars are created for public access and supported by voluntary donations and memberships. Again, a reminder to our members. So all VRA Canada members and WWI members receive free certificates for this session. Thank you again for your participation, and thank you immensely, Dr. Laura and Ms. April. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Goodbye.
And happy, healthy holidays. Bye.
Thank you.